Our scripture passage for today actually speaks to what the choir just sang about we're going to have some church and offer up some praise and worship to God. We read from a somewhat familiar passage for us when David brings the ark to Jerusalem in chapter 6 of 2 Samuel, beginning in verse 1. David gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. David and all the people with him set out and went from Baal, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God. They carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab. Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God. David and all the house of Israel were dancing before the Lord with all their might, with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. When they came, though, to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen shook it. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him there because he reached out his hand to the ark, and Uzzah died there beside the ark. David was afraid of the Lord that day. He said, "How can the ark of the Lord come into my care?" So David was unwilling to take the ark of the Lord into his care, into the city of David, and instead David took it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. It was told King David, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God." So David went and brought up the ark of God again from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. David danced before the Lord with all his might, girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself before the eyes of his servant's maid, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me in place of your father and all his household to appoint me as prince of Israel, the people of the Lord, that I have danced before the Lord." And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. There is a church in Lake County, in the Claremont area, which is quite large. They are called Real Life. And Real Life has a number of billboards in Lake County, and they proclaim that they are the real church for real people. If you haven't seen those billboards, you might soon, because Real Life is currently building out Orange County as we speak. Now, I drove past those billboards enough times on my commute out to Lake County to just kind of get a bee in my bonnet to stop one time and knock on the door and say, "I'd like a tour of a real church, please." I really did. And they gave me the tour, and I was looking for the real people in this real church. And I got a tour of their sanctuary, which they don't call a sanctuary. They actually call it the sound stage, and there's all the production gear behind glassed in when they call it the sound stage. And the coffee bar that was very trendy and hip looking. And if the soundstage music was too loud for you, you could worship in another area, which was called the upper room. They called it small. It was larger than the sanctuary of the church that I was pastoring at the time. About a month or two after that, the church that I was pastoring, South Lake, hosted some of the local pastors at a meeting. And wouldn't you know, if one of those hip young pastors, kind of with the really skinny jeans and the spirit patch, and they walked into the just beautiful sanctuary at South Lake, like this one with a lot of wood paneling and very, very intricate and ornate glasswork. And wouldn't you know that the hip young pastor from that large big box church came in and said, "Ooh, a real church." And I was like, "Oh, God, can I be snarky for just a moment here?" I mean, we laugh about that, but, a beautifully appointed sanctuary doesn't a real church make. Any more than a worship service that is professionally produced on a sound stage constitute worship for real people. Contrary to the claims of those marketing gurus out there at the big box churches, real churches comprised of real people have been doing real worship for much longer than there have been hip young pastors preaching from sound stages. And by the way, real churches comprised of real people doing real worship have been doing that longer than there were pipe organs too. I know that's a little bit of sacrilege to say during this service. If you go back far enough, you will find that there have been centuries of real worship being done by real people who are really honoring and glorifying their God through many forms of expression, through many styles and genres of music in many, many places, including, as we read in our text for today, people who were dancing and shouting and singing in the streets as they moved the ark of the Lord to its new resting place in the city of David, accompanied by what can only be described as some kind of a musical mashup of harps and lyres and trumpets and cymbals and castanets and all of those things, all of that happening at the same time. Now, the text that we read for today is what we might call a proof text. It's a go-to passage. It's a go-to passage for people who are trying to make their point or prove their argument. It was a go-to passage for an earlier generation of guitar-loving, drum-pounding young people who are mostly retired now, back when they wanted to introduce guitars and contemporary Christian music into beautifully appointed sanctuaries like this one. This text is also and has been a go-to or a proof text for people who say, well, dancing is appropriate if David danced before the Lord. And we might remember one of the most famous expressions of verse 14 from our text, which was in that wonderful movie called Footloose. You remember that one where Kevin Bacon famously quoted verse 14 in his argument to the town council that those high-spirited high school students just wanted to be able to dance at their prom. Kevin, quoting verse 14, says, "Wearing a linen ephod, David danced before the Lord with all his might." Our text, though, isn't just a proof text or a go-to text for people who want to justify a particular kind of music or who want to have a prom. Our text says so much more than that. If we read through, we actually are given two extremes of worship in this text, both of which are wrong. Two extremes of worship, both of which are wrong. The first one is overly enthusiastic worship. Worship that does not rightly approach God and does not comply with God's word. And the second is overly proper or stately worship that doesn't have any emotion or enthusiasm at all. Two extremes in our text today. overly enthusiastic that doesn't rightly approach and underestimates the holiness of God, and overly stately worship that we might call kind of frozen chosenness. Both of those extremes are wrong. Worship that doesn't rightly view God, that doesn't ascribe to God the kind of holiness and comply with God's word, as we see in this text, leads to death. Physical death and spiritual death. But at the same time, worship that is overly proper, overly stately, that avoids emotion and heartfelt worship and enthusiasm because people are too proud to humble themselves before a holy God, well, that leads to barrenness. Leads to barrenness, death or barrenness on either of the two extremes. We are, according to this text, to worship as David worshiped, seeking to worship God humbly in accordance with his word and also with heartfelt joy, ascribing to God our praise. And so we read in verse 2, David and all the people with him, some 30,000, set out from Baal, Judah, to bring the ark of God to Jerusalem. They carried the ark of God on a new cart. Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark on it. David's movement of the ark into his new capital city of Jerusalem was primarily a political move. It was to show his political authority as well as his religious leadership, because he was also responsible as the king for religious leadership. David made it quite a show of that. 30,000 men who accompanied the cart on its journey. And David did it the way he wanted to do it, on a new cart with the ark lifted up to show everyone I have authority over God himself. Ark wasn't supposed to be transported on a cart. If you look at some of those really fine details in some of the Old Testament passages that we usually consider flyover country, one of the things that you will read is that the ark was to be transported by Levites on poles resting on their shoulders, and it was kind of slung so that nobody touched it. That's how it was supposed to be transported. David, though, was more concerned with showing his power and his piety than carefully following the right procedures. Everything goes smoothly until they get to the threshing floor of Nacon. David and all the house of Israel were dancing before the Lord with all their might, with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. When they came to Nacon, Uzzah reached out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, because the oxen had stumbled and the ark was in danger of falling off the cart. David, in his haste to make this such a grand display of his power, didn't take into consideration the fact that the oxen might stumble and the ark might be in a perilous position. The image that we have here is of poor Uzzah, who knows he's not supposed to touch the ark, wondering what to do. It's something like if you were accompanying an elderly woman across the street and you wanted to make sure that she got safely across, but you didn't want to presume or offend by actually taking her elbow and supporting her. That's the image we have here. Uzzah wants to safely protect the ark on its journey, but he knows that it's going to offend if he actually touches the ark. But when the oxen stumble, he has no choice. He reaches out to brace the ark to prevent it from falling, and God, like an elderly woman who does not want to be helped across the street, was offended. And God is angry, and God strikes Uzzah down on the spot in front of all of those 30,000 revelers. God struck Uzzah because he reached out his hand to the ark and he died there beside the ark. Earlier generations used to have to use their imagination to know what being struck down by the God when you touch the ark looks like. Now that we have Raiders of the Lost Ark, we know that when we touch or open the ark, what happens? God's Spirit comes out and people are liquefied when that happened. Now, we don't know if that's exactly what happened to poor Uzzah, but that's probably enough comparable because everyone is quite shaken, including David. David is initially angry because God has interfered with David's plan for the big show, getting the ark into Jerusalem. And then David realizes almost immediately, get a little fearful of what I have actually done here. Verse 9, David was afraid of the Lord that day. He said, how can the ark of the Lord come into my care? Now, this is a question that David should have asked himself before he started out. Should have asked himself, how is it that I am to be given this responsibility as the political leader and God's chosen king and authority over the religious nation, which means that David's essentially the highest religious authority as well? Should have asked that question before he set out. That's a question we should also be asking ourselves, Christians in many different churches. How is it that our worship should be ordered in order to rightly come before a holy God? And if we are beginning to do things that are merely for our entertainment or our amusement, even if they are fun and enthusiastic and vibrant, if they are not God-honoring, and we've lost sight in all of that enthusiasm, in David's case, he lost sight of the religious aspect in that grand display of 30,000 people. I'm sure it was quite a show as they were all singing and dancing. David lost sight, though, of what was the most important thing. Overly enthusiastic, experiential, emotional expression that nevertheless underestimated God's holiness, did not rightly approach God. That's one extreme, and we see what happens. The text is very clear. You die. Uzzah is an example. He's set up. I mean, God has spoken on that. David waits 3 months. He parks the ark at a priest's house, says, I'm not touching it because I know I didn't do it correctly. Gets word that family is being blessed and realizes that's a sign it's time to continue with the procession. So he makes arrangements to go forward, this time with the Levites, with the poles, suspending the ark between them so nobody will touch it. And every 6 steps making a sacrifice just for good measure. And the ark continues on its journey to Jerusalem. Verse 16, as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. This is David's wife, the wife who he had won, you remember, as part of the prize for having slayed Goliath. David's wife comes out and says to him that she despises him in her heart. Now, Michal is the king's daughter, Saul's daughter. She was raised in the palace. She knew how a king was supposed to behave, and in her estimation, David, having taken off the robes of authority and laying them aside, and taking off the symbols, just as these are, symbols of academic achievement, symbols of earthly authority and learning. And Michal looks at David and says, you are not dressed properly to be a king or a priest. David says to Michal, verse 21, it was before the Lord who chose me over your father that I have danced before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in my own eyes. David's willingness to humble himself before God was one of those traits that God recognized, and that's why God chose him to be king, to supplant Saul. David's willingness to humble himself after he had so spectacularly failed with the first part of the journey in bringing the ark. David's willingness to humble himself, literally take off the robes of earthly authority and humble himself by dancing before the Lord in the presence of all of those people. Now, the linen ephod could be either a loincloth or a short apron-like garment, neither of which is probably appropriate for sanctuary or a school dance. Not the best proof text for Kevin Bacon to have used on that. And that was what was concerning Michal. She's perceiving this as dirty dancing. And yet David is making a symbolic statement. It's really not about dancing. Michal blows it. She fails to appreciate what he has done. She's so insistent on David being proper in her eyes as a proper king, as a proper leader, that she blows it. And the text tells us she had no more children. This is kind of like the death sentence for a woman in that culture. Her identity, and she's not heard from again after this. Worship which, in one case, like Uzzah, failed to appreciate and underestimates the holiness of God, or worship that Michal was insisting on, worship that was proper and appropriate and hands never raised above your head, according to Michal. So what are we to do? How do we find worship which rightly views God and rightly approaches God and also expresses the heartfelt joy and enthusiasm and exuberance of our hearts for God, not just for our own sake? And we realize that David, in what he did, was not really about dancing. It was about a king setting aside the pride and position that he had to demonstrate that he was a true servant leader of the people, a man who had been called to be God's shepherd, humbly worshiping God himself as a model for the people. David removes his robe, dances before the ark. He's confessing his past failure and affirming his future obedience to God, demonstrating that he was a proper political and religious authority for God's people. When we come to worship, without regard for what God has done for us, when we don't come humbly to worship, we're not truly worshiping God. You know, when we come in and we don't think about the fact that God himself stepped down out of divinity in Jesus, lowered himself, set aside his own divine authority to be tried and convicted and nailed to a cross, when we don't think about that, then all that we're doing is, it might be exuberant and exciting and amusing, but it's not truly worshiping God. And then when we come in and we don't show any enthusiasm or appreciation at all, then we're doing the same thing. We're negating what God has done for us. Corrie ten Boom was, you might recognize the name, she was in one of the death camps during World War II, and she knew the indecency and shame of being forced to disrobe when she was interred in a concentration camp. And she wrote afterwards, she said that the words of John 19:23 came to her in the midst of her embarrassment. She says, when the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes. She would later write, I never thanked Jesus for all that he endured for me. I never thanked him for willingly being stripped and humiliated for me. Now I appreciate what he did for me more than ever before. we experience God's power and His purpose and His presence in our lives when we give ourselves wholly to God in that kind of worship, with that kind of appreciation for all that God has done for us. God, who humbled Himself for us, deserves our heartfelt worship.